Hi, I'm Joachim Trier. I'm Danish-Norwegian. I'm a film director and co-writer of 6 feature films. I try to do something specific every time, but I think I'm really interested in the idea of memory and form.
Vet du hva? Vi må komme oss ut av det landet.
My grandfather, Erik Løken, made movies, and because there wasn't much of an infrastructure in Norway at the time, he only really made 2 feature films, The Hunt and Remonstrance. And he was kind of experimental. You know, Remonstrance consists of 5 reels that could be shown in any order and still make sense as a story, which I thought was very inspiring, that spirit of kind of modernistic experimentation with film form. But his idea about it was that it would be an inviting thing, like the audience should take charge and help the story be told rather than to be manipulated. So it was kind of a Brechtian idea of inviting a conversation with the audience, which I think is an inspiring notion. My father was a sound recordist and sound designer in movies, so I grew up on film sets a lot. And my mom made fiction and documentary films as well. But I also remember, for example, being on the set of Jan Troell, the Swedish master, and sensing how kind he was and how, as a child, he talked to me and wanted to know my name and said nice things about my dad, you know. And I was really moved by the vibe and seeing how the actors felt safe. And it made a difference. I could tell as a child. And I think so that's literally inspiring for how I would love this set to be. And I didn't grow up watching so many Norwegian films. There weren't that many interesting films when I grew up. Once in a while there was something. But I think I had to look to the world. Obviously, America and Hollywood was tremendously important. And also, you know, humanist kind of cinema I remember from early childhood, you know, Kramer versus Kramer, films of Woody Allen, Paul Mazursky, things that my parents loved and I could see were more lifelike, yet slightly elevated. That was interesting. But to be honest with you, as I really, really became a kind of a film geek myself and watched a lot of movies, I think to discover great experimental modernism from Europe from the late 50s to the mid-60s.
4 fois au musée.
Quel musée à Hiroshima?
Hiroshima Mon Amour, I still think is one of the greatest films ever made, and you can always reference it. And if, you know, aliens landed and asked, what is this cinema? You could show them that almost like a Citizen Kane of mid-century modernism, of encapsulating deep psychological understanding of character, but also the historical aspects, the documentary aspects, the radical shift in how editing and montage was brought into narrative cinema.
Pourquoi nier l'évidente nécessité de la mémoire?
I'm very cautious of formal cinema that just becomes remote or somehow is there for a fancy purpose. But I think someone like Alain Resnais, you know, Nicholas Roeg, Fellini, you know, if you look at 8.5, it's a deeply human film, but it gets us into the human experience through its formal elements. So that, at the beginning, as I was starting to make short films, I think that really inspired me.
Är det en speciell gutt? Det kanske inte alls är en gutt. Lucka ögonen.
I have 2 collaborators on all the 6 features, and even most of the shorts that I've made. And it's Eskil Vogt, my co-writer, and it's Olivier Bugge-Coté, the editor. He's edited everything almost I've done, including all the shorts. So I think we've gone through the stages of life together in a way, and also our formal curiosities about movies, the craft, and trying to catch a vibe of certain things. But I also think if you jump completely away from us in time and space and look at what we represent, I'm realizing, I'm 51 now, that the 3 of us grew up in a climate in Scandinavia, ideologically being atheist, being affected in direct and indirect ways by the Second World War, by Freud and Marx, and all these things that we are kind of obsessed with that movement of time and change. I was 15 in '89 when the Berlin Wall came down, and I felt history. You know, I felt that the Cold World War and the anxiety of growing up in Norway, bordering to Russia and being a NATO ally, and that anxiety that the world could end at any moment during the 80s, and then suddenly glasnost and perestroika and things changed. I mean, so all of these things affect how you see history changing and time moving. But on a personal level, I didn't grow up on a farm where seasons come and go and everything is circular. I very much felt that time was an arrow, you know, and I think that movies are great at portraying that because, like memory, you film your friends on Super 8 or my skate movies on High 8 and all these formats, and I look back at them and some of them are dead now, some of them are older, you know, the city changed, they changed. Cinema can deal with that. It's very specific.
Jeg husker at pappa satt alltid på kjøkkenet og røkte. Og drakk kaffe og hørte på radio. P2.
Jeg husker ikke så mye Oslo, det jo menneskene man husker.
So I think it's coming back to those existential themes of time and memory that I care about the most in my life, really. I'm really interested in working with actors. And I met Anders through the casting of Reprise, almost 20 years ago now, in 2005. Yeah, I felt that we were kind of two kids making our first kind of personal film together and learning how to do it. I learned a lot from Anders. He's very intelligent, but also very emotionally available. And to work with him and try to figure out how not to say too much, how to let him play around. He's also a musician, and we came up together with this idea of, I think he coined it, to give him credit, the idea of a jazz take, which is that we plan, we rehearse, we talk about the dialogue. Eskil Vogt and I redraft the script before we go on set again, you know, so that it's tailored to the actors. That little small refinements, leaving words out, bringing other words in. But on the day when shooting, that there's also a space for not just trying to nail the text, but to do something beyond it. There's a great example in Oslo, August 31st, where he's on the bench with one of his best friends, and there's this moment when he says, everything is going to be okay.
Ja, du tenker jo sånn, da. Med en mellomrom så tenker du sånn, og så går det over. Men det kjipt når det står på.
Det kommer til å bli bedre. Alt kommer til å ordne seg. You could.
And that's not written. That's something that happens as we did jazz takes, and he was kind of so exhausted from running that scene over and over again, and he was in this very vulnerable place, I think, emotionally in that day, and he said that, and it's just like, that's it. You know, I come from skateboard movies. I filmed everything in my youth, and I stood by a big staircase looking at friends trying to do crazy tricks out and trying to support them and keeping the faith that they would land and not break their neck. And they would sometimes land and drive away, and I got it on, goes in the movie, you know, and I still feel that sense of an event, an occurrence of something unexpected to be at the core of filming with actors. I think if you really want to figure out how a director works, it's to figure out the chaos control dynamic and their approach to making a film. What do they love to plan, and what needs to be kind of lifelike and chaotic? And in my case, I know that I really plan. I spend time on location with the cinematographers, and I spend time with the actors, getting to know them so I can stimulate and help them. Not making everything perfect. The scenes and stuff, we push some energy forward to the actual shooting day. But around the camera on the day, I'm really interested in having such a safe environment and having everything so meticulously planned that we can actually be very free and change our mind any moment and have that spirit of discovery. That's where life happens. So, for example, the cafe scene in Oslo, August 31st, we know that he's dreadfully lost and doesn't know how to continue. And we shot some very planned things and also some documentary. We kind of had that cafe, and we had people coming in and out, and we tried to control sound. And I was listening on the radio suddenly about this idea of people doing bucket lists. And there was a young woman who read out her bucket list, and it was so sweetly naive. And I was in my mid-30s by then, and like feeling that life, you know, it's like a lot of different things are difficult. And I wasn't as depressed as that character, but I certainly didn't feel I figured out what my place in kind of bourgeois life was. You know, everyone around me had kids, and I was just this movie nut that just kept making movies and didn't know how to create a home. And it was all these things. And I heard this young woman read out her wishes to swim with dolphins and write a novel. And it's just, it moved me so deeply because that's the human spirit of this youth and openness that Anders has lost. And it's kind of the mechanisms of film that you can kind of do something purposeful and intended and dramatic and put it up against some reality that you don't control and try to create something out of that. I've written all the 6 features I've directed by now with Eskil Vogt. Both him and I are very inspired by other art forms and literature and this stuff, but we play around a bit with form and representation of how do we get into the mind of the characters. So in a very banal way, I think films create objects out of human beings. So then the virtue is how do we transcend the objective surface of just looking at something, and how do we get into the mind, idea of consciousness. And sometimes we try to find original ways of using voiceover, not by telling the story, but by countering the image to create something in between. So for example, in Louder Than Bombs, we had this idea of using voiceover in a way we hadn't seen before, which was that the young Conrad, played by Devin Druid in the story, is a teenager. He's in class, he's falling in love with a girl in his class, and she's reading aloud from a book. And slowly, as he's kind of spacing into his own thoughts, her voice becomes the voiceover of him contemplating the death of his mother, played by Isabelle Huppert.
Seconds that were not seconds anymore, but stretched out to minutes.
And on one level, it could be a gimmick.
Time suspended.
But also on a different level, formally, if he's erotically and amorously fascinated by this young girl and he thinks about his mother's death, that fascinates me. Call me a Freudian, but like that gives a different dimension to it, possibly, So, these ways of trying to use voiceover and montage has been exciting, but I'm also someone who more and more realizes that the space between people in dialogue scenes can be equally interesting. I'm really obsessed with trying to get into intimate spaces between people, and sometimes just working with close-ups, reactions, and how the editing of staying on listeners rather than the speaker and all that stuff can really create subjective experiences of being in the middle of some intimate yearning for contact between people. And I find that, strangely enough, to be equally formally interesting sometimes.
Fy faen, for en brutal ting å si om seg selv. Hvor fucka er du egentlig?
På en skala fra 1 til 100?
Ja.
80.
But I was also very inspired by the idea of telling stories that were elegant, yet I could sense there was a sense of melancholy. Like with Antonioni, it reminds me of the writing of Henry James, or this idea that even if people in kind of post-war Europe or the middle class I grew up in have a lot of freedom and a lot of choices and have a lot of privilege, life is still complicated. Relationships are not as simple as they should be. Love is complicated, the meaning of it all. The idea of mortality in a world that I grew up in as an atheist, where this is what you got, what do you do with it? Society's giving you all these options, why are you failing at those? And that, even in the closest of relationship, there might be this kind of slippery gap of non-connectedness, which is brutal. I also think there's a whole array of filmmakers that show us the world in its tactility and its physical presence. And Tarkovsky, to me, is really one of the people that has inspired me the most. And if I lose faith that cinema, where are we going, what do we do? I think that to look at Mirror or Stalker, or something like that, always makes me feel that in the same way that I love David Lynch, that you can actually look at the world through a specific gaze, and it becomes deeper, and it's being explored, and it's as if the everyday is not reality. The reality happens in the film. It's a deeper look at what the world actually is.
After a few days, you feel better in the role. No, it's not even a role. You like it. They want you there. They love you. You can feel it. And you love them too, more than anything,